So thank you so much for joining this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, though, we are thrilled to welcome Caitlin Starling and Wendy N Wagner. Caitlin Starling writes horror-tinged speculative fiction of all flavors. Her first novel, The Luminous Dead, won the LOHF Best Debut Award and was awarded both the Bram Stoker and Locust Awards. Was nominated for both those. Yes, she is also the author of the gothic horror tale, The Yellow Jessamine, as well as the novella in the Vampire the Masquerade audio collection, Walk Among Us. Her nonfiction has appeared in Nightmare and Uncanny. In The Death of Jane Lawrence, the practical, unassuming Jane Shoringfield has done the calculations and decided the most secure path forward is a husband in a marriage of convenience that will allow her to remain independent and occupied with meaningful work. Her first choice, the dashing but reclusive Dr. Augustine Lawrence, agrees to her proposal with only one condition, that she must never visit Lindridge Hall, his crumbling family manor outside of town. Yet on their wedding night, an accident strands her at his door in a pitch black rainstorm, and she finds him changed. Gone is the bold, courageous surgeon, and in his place a terrified, paranoid man, one who cannot tell reality from nightmare and fears Jane is an apparition come to haunt him. By morning, Augustine is himself again, but Jane knows something is deeply wrong at Lindridge Hall and with the man she has so hastily bound her safety to. Set in a dark mirror version of post-war England, Starling crafts a new kind of gothic horror from the bones of the beloved canon. So Starling will be joined in conversation by Wendy N Wagner, a Hugo Award-winning editor of Nightmare Magazine and author of An Oath of Dogs and the upcoming The Secret Skin, coming out on October 26th. So this event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, as well as if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Caitlin and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. A link to buy the Death of Jane Lawrence, along with Caitlin and Wendy's other books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. So thank you both for joining us, and yeah, we're thrilled to have you here.
Super excited to be back.
It is so good to be back. It's fun to be at Powell's again, isn't it?
Yes.
So it sounds like Caitlin has a little bit of a reading prepared for us before we go into some fun talk about spooky stories. Why don't you start us off with that, Caitlin? I can't wait.
So for those of you, because I know there are a couple who were also at the event at Copper Dog Books last night, this is a different reading. It is actually slightly before what you heard last night. So rewinding a bit, all you need to know going into this, because it is still a couple chapters in, is that Augustine and Jane have just gotten married. Jane is under the assumption and understanding that she is never going to go to Lindridge Hall. She's fine with that. Everything is under control. And then they leave the courthouse. Okay, actually, slight backup, because you need to know one other thing is that they kissed before, around the time they got engaged, and then they went, oh no, we weren't supposed to do that. This is a business arrangement. It's a marriage of convenience. Jane hasn't been able to stop thinking about that though. So with that said, she hadn't been able to keep her eyes off him. She'd watched how gentle he was with his patients, how firm when it was needed, and how solicitous when compassion was called for instead. A few mornings he'd arrived looking like he hadn't slept at all, though she knew from his notes that there hadn't been any house calls during the night. She hoped only that he had not been kept up by thoughts of her. He looked the same now as they emerged from the ceremony hall into the blinding sunlight of an unseasonably favorable day, surrounded by a bustle of activity that seemed too great for the scant number of guests they'd invited. Jane stopped in the doorway, staring, the size of the crowd far too much. Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham led the charge as it converged in on them, and she went rigid as they were both hoisted into the carriage that would take them to the surgery. The gathered crowd cheered, growing as people she did not know, drawn by the commotion, circled the carriage itself. The horses threw their heads at the attention and the noise, and Jane retreated into the marginally quieter, very much darker interior of the cab, shutting the door firmly behind them. Well, Dr. Lawrence, she managed. Well, Mrs. Lawrence, he responded, voice a little huskier than usual. He stole a glance at her in her bright blue wedding dress. A boyish smile curled his lips, then fell as he looked out the window. There are so many, he said. She shrugged helplessly. The carriage lurched into motion, and Jane waited for the sound of the crowd to fade. It didn't. As they rattled through the streets, the wedding guests and the accumulated onlookers kept pace, shouting and laughing and hugging one another. Jane turned bright red as she stared out the small window in the cab door. She'd seen these parades before, friends and family escorting the newlywed couple to their home, some wearing masks, others playing loud music intended to celebrate, to mark the transition from independence to marriage. But the thought that they could do the same for her seemed alien, terrifying, the weight of their attention on her far too much. What was she meant to do? How was she meant to act? I truly didn't think anybody would care about the wedding, Augustine said. And yet we have an audience. And just this morning, I received a letter from my colleagues in Camhurst proposing that they come to celebrate the nuptials in person. I turned them down, of course, he added hastily, and as she tensed still further, the crowd outside was bad enough. Hosting house guests would have stressed her far more. Across the small gap between them, Augustine seemed to feel much the same. He grew paler with every second the noise outside did not abate, and he clutched the edge of the seat, knuckles white. They mean us well, she said, trying to reassure them both. But with the crowd around them, the carriage wasn't able to make the turn that would take them to the surgery. Instead, the crowd bore them faster and faster toward the edge of town. Augustine made a pained sound and finally lurched toward the door, opening it even as the cobbled road gave way to dirt beneath them. Mr. Lowell, he called. The older man appeared, grinning and doffing his hat in congratulations. Dr. Lawrence, Mrs. Lawrence. We are meant for the surgery, Augustine's cry barely surmounted the din of the crowd, which seemed to double, triple with every passing minute. Jane couldn't recognize half the unmasked faces in the crowd. She trembled, unsure of how to process such a great parade. It wasn't for her, and it wasn't for him. Was it only for a marriage? Or were they all relieved to see her gone? Mr. Lowell had lost his words and was turning a brilliant vermilion. He stammered. I had thought you would both be headed to Lindridge Hall tonight, sir, it being your wedding night and all. Mrs. Lawrence's traveling case has already been sent on ahead. Augustine went very still, even with the jolting of the wheels, and Jane thought for a moment he might throw himself from the carriage. As she watched, he closed his eyes as if fighting for control over himself. Jane leaned into the open doorway. It's all right, she said. I can send home for another set of clothing. We just need to turn the carriage around. Can you help us? Mr. Lowell worried at the brim of his hat. So you mean to live at the surgery regularly? Yes, I will be living there full time. Dr. Lawrence will continue living at, what did you call it, Lindridge Hall? Aye, Lindridge Hall. He struggled to keep pace with the carriage and stay close to the door, the crowd pushing on him from all sides. Frustrated, he hopped up onto the rail below the door, grabbing onto the top of the carriage to brace himself. Well-wishers cheered, grinning at Jane, waving and shouting and dancing. Somewhere behind them, a full band had begun to play, a cacophony of off-tempo brass and flutes. She was trapped in a nightmare. Mr. Lowell turned his attention once more to Augustine, who was clutching tight to the door handle. Sir, I apologize. I had thought that when you asked for the spare bedroom to be fully appointed that you meant it for later, when you'd both stay here on occasion. Not tonight, but I don't know. He grimaced, looking over his shoulder. I don't know that I can stop such a great crowd without causing a scene. She didn't care about causing a scene, not really, but she could see her guardians out among the crowd, delighted and happy and proud, and she didn't want to hurt them. She froze, unable to decide. Mr. Lowell, Augustine said at last, have you also sent ahead the ingredients I had you purchase for dinner? Yes, sir. He sat back in his seat, letting go of the door. Mr. Lowell braced it instead. Grimacing, Augustine said, then I suppose we will be dining at Lindridge Hall tonight, but I will be sending Mrs. Lawrence back to the surgery at sunset. That way she can fetch her belongings and the crowd need not be disrupted. He said it all in a strange, strained voice, and Mr. Lowell only nodded and said, yes, doctor. He dropped back to the ground and shut the door behind him. Jane searched Augustine's face. He'd very eagerly agreed to the part of their arrangement where they would live separately, even more than the proposed lack of intimacy. He had never gone back on that element, not even as they had discussed consummation and flirted around the edges of their business arrangement. It had struck her as odd, but it had aligned with what she needed, even as the rest of her plans fell apart, and so she hadn't questioned it. But now, even given how uncomfortable the wedding procession was making the both of them, she couldn't understand. I wouldn't mind staying the night at Lindridge Hall. It would no doubt be much easier, she said. We can satisfy the legal requirements, then resume our arrangements tomorrow. No, he said, looking directly at her for the first time since the crowd had formed. He didn't blush, didn't flinch. She frowned. It is our wedding night. It seems appropriate that you will never stay the night in Lindridge Hall. His expression took on a darkness that she'd never seen before, not even the day that Mr. Renton had died. But then he shook himself. Please understand that, he said, voice softening. Whatever else may or may not change about our arrangement, that needs to remain true. You will never stay the night at Lindridge Hall, and I always will. Why? He ran an absent hand through his hair. His dark suit and shirt were rumpled from the ride already. He looked abstracted and beautiful. Jane once more found herself wanting to kiss him, damn everything else. She pushed the impulse away. Why, Augustine? Because, he said, if a patient comes to the surgery when I am out, Mr. Lowell can send for you tonight if he has to, just as I would if that happened. He didn't answer immediately, looking away from her and out at the crowd. His eyes grew unfocused. At last he said, because Lindridge Hall is not fit for you. It's been empty for many years, and while I employ a cook and a maid, they are not there full time. It is a very dark place. You'll be far more comfortable in the surgery. Why must you stay there then? He grimaced. The carriage rocked as the dirt track they were on grew rougher, but the noise from outside continued despite the less pleasant terrain. It's my family home, and there's nobody else to keep it. You can't rent it out or stay only a few nights a week? When he'd first laid down this rule, she'd accepted it at face value. She had marked it as none of her business. But now that she had kissed him, had worked beside him, had learned the sort of man he was beyond her statistical analysis, none of this made sense. Augustine Lawrence should have wanted to stay close to his patients, if not to her. It has a lot of history, he said at last. It's complicated. Call it my pet irrationality, but we will hold to the terms of the agreement, won't we? Her unease refused to quiet, but she could rise above it for the sake of the pain she could see in his eyes. She nodded. Of course. I'll leave before sunset.
Ooh, that was so exciting, Caitlin. As you all can see, this is a book with some very unusual characters and a powerful sense of place. Lindridge Hall, I really, I'm lucky. I got to read this book before the rest of you. And anyway, I just loved Lindridge Hall. I thought it was super fun. And I also love the fact that it has a small staff. It's like there's, it's not like Augustine is some super wealthy lord or something who's got, servants coming out of ears, but there's a pretty regular presence here with Mr. Lowell, his assistant at the surgery, and then you've got Mrs. Pearl and Mrs. Lundbright. Did I get that right?
Luthbright, yeah.
Luthbright. Oops. I wrote this down, but my handwriting is so bad. And so they're kind of a constant presence in this book. In the scene that you just read, you get a sense of the fact that there are people who are always being watched, and that sense continues throughout the novel. Do you want to talk about that at all? About like what it was like writing, about people who are like have staff, have people who are like hanging on them, kind of like a proto paparazzi, if you would.
Yeah, so there's two elements to this. That's probably going to be how I lead into every single answer. I think I did that last night too. But one of them is personally that I often I'm very aware of when I'm being observed or being watched, and I'm trying to make sure that I am behaving as expected. I know people for whom that is even more of a thing, that they can really just sense that oh, I don't play music very loud because I don't want my neighbor to hear it, sort of thing. So that was a really, I feel, familiar and accessible anxiety that I could play on and evoke hopefully in my readers, and also allow my characters to respond to as well. The other thing is specific to Gothic. Gothic tends to have this sense of being watched, whether it's, the eyes moving in the painting, very traditional, or just oftentimes, the protagonist has just married into a new family, and that new family or the staff at that house is watching them, judging them, usually finding them to come up a little bit short. One of the first Gothic books I ever read, I was a kid, I read Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is constantly being watched throughout that entire book. Her life is in many ways determined by people's observations of her, even though she tries to have she manages to keep a very strict sense of self through a lot of the book. And I think that that's just a really common element in Gothic stories. It's this sense that there is no privacy. Even when you're alone, it's not private. And I'm really glad you asked this, because in Wendy's novella that's coming out, The Secret Skin, there's a lot of that as well, especially staff who have been at the house and know the history more than the people who are living in the house, which is something that I sidestepped in Jane Lawrence, but I'm fascinated by, the sort of living embodiment of the house being the people who are employed there, more so than the people who necessarily own the house.
Right. Yeah. Like you can't help but think of the housekeeper and Rebecca, right? Like she's such a presence in that book. And so she knows everything that's ever happened in the house, so much more than, the man in that story. Yeah. So I think that element of the Gothic is so strong in this book, and really kind of ties it in with that tradition. So fun. Did you have a good time writing these characters?
The characters, yes. The situations where they're being watched, very stressful to write, to channel that. There is a scene a little bit further into the book where, those colleagues who Augustine mentioned is saying like, oh, we should come down and come visit your house. They just ignore that no that Augustine gave them and show up unannounced. And that sequence is both one of the, I think, the most interesting in the book, just because suddenly there's this feeling of being invaded, and Jane is representative of the house now. Like she has to stand in for the house and defend the house's honor, so to speak, against these other people. Before she's even, she's on perhaps on the fence herself of how much she wants to tie herself to Lindridge Hall by that point, but she doesn't really have a choice in the face of an audience. But writing that sequence was like white knuckle terrifying. It originally did not take place at Lindridge Hall. It took place in a completely separate location, and it made all the sense in the world to bring it into the house. But it's like this gut churning, like, oh God, no feeling when they show up.
I mean, even just like reading it was stressful.
Yeah. And when you're having, say, drama in your marriage, you don't want people there, right? You don't want people to see all of that. And you don't want people to be misinterpreting any of it, or coming to conclusions that you're not comfortable coming to yet. Sometimes it takes a while to decide what you're going to do about a problem, and you really don't need other people weighing in on it.
It felt too in that scene like there's kind of an element of class, and like, because Jane, she has not gone to university, and all of Augustine's, all of these people went to medical school with him and are doctors, and they come from very highfalutin backgrounds. And she doesn't, right? Like she's a really smart person, but she doesn't have that kind of status. And I think that was really, that was a really cool thing to watch her be with these people. And she really, like, reading this story, she's neither fish nor fowl, right? Like, which is always how it is for the main characters in Gothic novels. They don't fit in with the servants, they don't fit in with the aristocrats. And is that something you wanted to explore, or is it just something that sort of fell in and you just ran with it?
Yeah, it came up naturally as I was writing it, partially just because, I wanted Jane to be in some ways disconnected from, a support network. It's always easier to put characters in horrible situations if they don't have a support network. So part of it was that, and it also enhances that feeling of not really having privacy. She can't be herself with Augustine's employees. She can't be herself with Augustine's friends and colleagues. She can't be herself with her. She's the guardian, or she's the ward of a local judge and his wife who leave fairly early in the story. And she can't even be herself around them either, because she has this sense of, well, they took me in when I was a little girl, and now I'm in my 20s, and they were willing to pay my way in the capital city just so that I could not have to move out. And I feel like a burden, and I don't want to be that. So I'm going to present myself as not a burden. I'm going to make all these decisions and plans that will allow me to sort of keep my life the way I want it, with a minimum of prying from other people. And that part is partially why she approaches Augustine with this idea of, let's have a marriage that is almost an employment agreement. You know, I will work for you at your surgery. You will be legally married to me, so I won't be an unmarried woman. I will continue to work. I won't have to like raise a family because we both have agreed we don't want families. And you'll leave every night and I'll get the house to myself. Sounds great. Problem, he's actually really intelligent and handsome and caring and skilled, and oh no, she catches feelings very quickly, and it did not think that that was even on the table. And then has to figure out like, okay, well now I'm vulnerable to him too. Now I care about what he thinks of me.
Right. Yeah. I think within, you know, just a few pages of the beginning, you're already like, oh, Jane, you're in over your head. You're in trouble now. But it was great because we always think, oh, well, with romance, that's like the solving of the problem. But for Jane, that's actually like where shit gets real, right? Like that's makes every problem so much worse for her.
Yeah.
So we've got some questions coming up, and actually one of them ties into something that we wanted to talk about a little. So the book is set in Lindridge Hall. I have, before we delve further, I did have one question about Lindridge Hall. So like the Lawrence family lives there. Why is it called Lindridge Hall? How did it get its name?
I don't super know, but I mean, Lindridge Hall would basically be the ridge with the linden trees on it, right?
Oh,
so it's
sense.
probably just named after the landscape. But you know, what is it in Jane Eyre? Is it Thorndale?
Oh yeah.
Something called. Anyway, yeah. Thorndale does not tie to Rochester, obviously.
That's true. Yeah.
And there is an extent to which the Lawrence family has a lot of history to it, as often is the case in Gothic stories, but not all of it is accessible to Jane. And as it kind of Augustine in that passage hints, like he's not super comfortable talking about it. And his family is not there. His family is very importantly not there. They never appear in the book. They're alive, but for some reason, they don't come to Lindridge Hall, and they don't care that their son just got married.
Gee, what's going on there? Not interesting at all. So when you were writing about Lindridge Hall, are you like, did you have like a really clear like floor plan for it? How'd you like develop it? Because it is like a place like that. Like when I was reading it, I could just imagine walking through and exploring the different wings and prowling around.
I've sketched little floor plans, never like fully detailed ones. It is possible that some of the house still doesn't quite make sense. I think that adds to it. I did almost build it in The Sims at one point just to see if I could, and then I got distracted and didn't do that. But I did just like, so when I wrote books and books ago, when I wrote The Luminous Dead, that entire book takes place in a cave, and caves compared to houses are a lot harder to describe. And so I feel like I've trained in how to communicate the layout of a complex space in such a way that at the very least, you know how the important areas connect to each other. So in this case, you know that you learn pretty early on that the Lindridge Hall's entryway is, 2-story vaulted ceiling, and there's stairs, and it's a 3-story house. And on the 3rd floor, there is a room that is entirely like roofed in glass, as if it were a conservatory. You don't get to go to it immediately, but you get to see that from the outside, and you learn where Augustine's study is, and you learn where Augustine's bedroom is, and where the dining room is. But a lot of the house, Jane learns quite quickly after that section, is closed off, not inaccessible. The rooms aren't, well, most of the rooms aren't locked, but there's nothing in them, or there's really old furniture. And it looks like it's, been abandoned for a lot longer, maybe than it has been. But if you've ever actually been in an abandoned house, stuff starts decaying very quickly. especially the town they're in, Larrington, is in a very sort of, they're just starting to enter their wet, rainy winter season. So I wonder where I got that from. Is it possibly that I lived in Oregon for 8 years?
So would you say that Lindridge Hall was it a character in the novel? Like, do you feel like it had so much of a presence in your mind that it was somebody more than just someplace?
It was at least 3/4 of the way there. There are certain elements in the book, that things that Jane discovers that also have a sort of personhood to them. And those things sort of blur in my mind with Lindridge Hall, the house.
Yeah.
So it definitely has a character, and it definitely has opinions about Jane. They're complex opinions, which is kind of weird for a house, I guess, but it doesn't actually mind her being there. But Augustine minds her being there, and in some ways the house is Augustine, but in some ways the house is very much not Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways the house gets to know her much better than it ever knew Augustine.
I definitely got that
there
feeling.
For spoiler reasons.
Let's see. So we definitely were touching on in our talk about like Jane and the way she doesn't fit in and stuff. Something that we kind of talked about when we were emailing was like this sense of, that's very common in Gothic novels. It's this main character who just feels inadequate to the situation they're in. And it's really interesting to me because Jane is a pretty complex mix of somebody who is really capable, right? Like, she's very intelligent. She is great at accounting. She's very smart at math. She winds up being very helpful in the surgery. But like the situations that she's put in, particularly socially, are really overwhelming. That seems to be like sort of her weak spot, is her socialization. I've seen some people who think that perhaps Jane is even neurodivergent, and
Bingo.
I kind of thought she might have been. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I very briefly, because I talked about it last night, and there's an essay coming out about it. But,
great.
Yeah,
where will that be coming out from?
Oh, it's going to be on Sarah Lee's newsletter.
Oh, great.
Stone Soup. And it's either going to be next week or the week following. I think it's next week, though. But yeah, so Jane is in many ways modeled after me. I'm autistic. Jane is too. We don't have completely the same presentation, but we have enough that I was trying to explore some aspects of my own perception of the world through her, basically. And then it developed from there as she became her own character, person, whatever, separate from me. And it was really interesting getting to write a character who, like, she knows what her limitations are. She doesn't, and she has strategies for dealing with them. But those strategies get really tested over the course of the book. And like you said, a lot of things actually play to her strengths, aside from the social elements of it. Her strengths come up quite a bit during the course of the book. They're not just like, oh, she's good at these things and now we're never going to talk about them again because we need her to be vulnerable in this house. It's, okay, she's good at accounting and now she has her hands on Augustine's old ledger books from when he was in college. Or Jane has just started dipping a toe into magic, and somehow it is very similar to calculus.
There are a lot of people who are very interested in that aspect of all this math stuff, by the way, according to what I see in the Q&A.
Good. We will definitely talk about it. But there was this, I always like to approach characters and plot as whatever a character's greatest strength is also going to be their biggest vulnerability. It's more interesting that way. As much as the book plays on her insecurities and her overwhelm when it comes to social situations, and that does play into the plot, primarily what happens is her biggest strengths come back to bite her in some way. Not always like in an obvious way or a direct way, but I really like exploring that method of storytelling.
I think that's really cool. It makes this book a much more exciting and fun read than it could be, I think. And it makes Jane just, she's a powerful character. I love her. Let's see. So what was the seed of this novel? Like, did you, sometimes a story will be like, I have a character in mind. I have this wonderful person. I have to do something with them. And sometimes it's more like, oh, I have a great place, or I have a great weird idea. Where did this one start?
I saw Crimson Peak in theaters.
Ah, yay!
And I think actually I saw it at the Pioneer Square movie theater, if I recall correctly. Anyway, saw it, really enjoyed it, loved the aesthetics of it, loved the the interpersonal tension, loved pretty much everything about it. But it made me think about all the times where I've wanted the girl to get the bad guy, like romantically. And I really loved, as I said, Jane Eyre as a kid. And part of that was, at the time, I really loved Jane and Rochester. I've always loved Beauty and the Beast narratives. They're never entirely satisfying to me, but there's a lot in them that I really, really enjoy. And so I walked out of Crimson Peak and I went, wouldn't it be cool to write a story like that, with big crumbling house, marriage under less than honest circumstances, perhaps, but have it so that the heroes or the spouses, the antagonist, we'll say antagonist because not really a villain, antagonist, redemption does not require death, but it requires like a reordering of the relationship. Because I think it's more interesting if they actually, if both characters actually have to contribute to solving the problem, that perhaps one of them is more hand in creating than the other. And this shifted as I was especially revising the book. The relationship between Jane and Augustine got a little bit more complex than I had first imagined it to be. But that was a lot of it. I think also around that time, I saw a really pretty picture of Gwendolyn Christie. And so that is part of why Jane is about 6 feet tall with blonde hair and freckles. It looks like a certain actress. And I have always really liked doctor characters. And I was like, you know what? Her husband's going to be a doctor. And sort of from there, all of the building blocks that I needed started coming into play. Obviously, this is a gothic story. There may or may not be ghosts. There are ghosts. They may or may not be real. Let's put it that way. So I knew I was going to have that. And I don't remember when magic and math got involved, but it was pretty early. And the magic in particular came from listening to a couple episodes of the podcast, Last Podcast on the Left, where they were talking about, in particular, the history of esoteric magic in Western Europe, mostly England, Order of the Golden Dawn, Thelema, that sort of thing, into modern chaos magic. And I was like, I can do something with this, because ritual magic is fascinating in how it creates groups of people. Like the Order of the Golden Dawn was an association, I think actually it's still in existence, but at its height, definitely association of people, mostly pretty wealthy. Turns out you need money to decide you're going to go hang out with a bunch of your buddies at the club and wave swords around and light candles. And I was like, oh, I want to explore like who would be in a thing like this. I later learned that at one point, Aleister Crowley tried to take over the headquarters at some point, and Yates kicked him down the stairs.
Yes. Wow.
And just the amount of that, I didn't get to go into that much exploration because, of course, they're stuck in a house. But let's just say Augustine's past is a little bit tied up in something like that. I don't think he ever got kicked down the stairs or kicked someone else down the stairs.
Well, I'm glad he's
prequel material. I don't know.
Yes, yay. Stair Kicking by Caitlin Starling. That's super cool and fascinating. I love stuff about secret societies, and so that was something that for me was extremely compelling about this book, was all these people dabbling in magic, and it was super fun. That's super cool. So I don't know if people, I mean, some of the people were at your reading before, but other folks might not really know about the fact that this is not set in our world. It's like an alternate history, which is always extra fun.
What is this world called? Big remix of history, basically.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit to break about down the world. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to break down what it is, and then I'll talk about why it is.
Okay, cool.
So the biggest elements that you might recognize are in recent history. So when Jane was a child, she lived in the equivalent of London, which was shelled, not bombed. They don't have airplanes, but it was attacked with incendiary devices and chemical warfare agents. So right there, you have a mashup of World War II Blitz and World War I trench warfare. So already we're like, okay, this is not our world. They are at around the 1890s in terms of most of their technology, and also their medical knowledge, and especially surgical knowledge. Antiseptic technique is known. They do wash their hands, but they do still do bloodletting. And surgeries are still pretty risky, even with the advent of that kind of technique. Fashion-wise, it's about the 1860s, because why not? I like the big skirts and the hats. Great. And finally, the math is around the 1600s because, and this is where I'll start explaining why I was doing this. The math, Jane is just learning calculus. And not only is she just learning it, it is just being really introduced to where she lives. It is a new mathematics that is being explored. And when calculus was first developed in Europe, I think it was developed separately elsewhere earlier, it looked impossible. It looked like magic. Sir Isaac Newton had a hand in it. He was in fact an alchemist. He was a practicing alchemist. We know this about him. And the act of several of the things that you do in calculus require things like dividing by 0, which you may know gives you a huge error on your calculator. It breaks everything. And it also has to do with concepts of infinity, which I'm sure we have all sat up going, you know, having stoner thoughts or otherwise about, wow, like what is infinity? And these two things, 0 and infinity, by the way, are incredibly related, but in ways you probably wouldn't expect and that I don't fully understand, but I really enjoy reading about. So that all like is right adjacent to magic. You can really easily look at it from the side and suddenly you're like, well, okay, if you can take the area under a curve by taking smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller regular shapes out of it until they become nothing. And that's not supposed to work, but it gives you the right answer. What's to say magic isn't real? Like, and also, if I'm going to do this geometric proof over and over again to understand why it works the way it does, well, that's just a ritual. Where if you pay attention to the steps, you eventually internalize the logic behind the steps, even if at the beginning you don't understand it and you're just memorizing it or just repeating it. So that's why 1600s math is in there. And the rest of it is this cauldron of influences I wanted Jane to have. I wanted also to be able to have, without anyone questioning me, women surgeons. Like that was just a really, yeah, that's what I want to do. They're going to be in there. I don't want to have to be like, this is Victorian England, but we're going to allow women surgeons. And that's the only divergence. I was like, well, I might as well start picking at things. So that's going to be involved. I'm going to have the particular moment in medicinal history that I want to use. And also I want to free the world building from having to be beholden to history. So for instance, their religious system is different / is basically decimated at the moment because they are 20 years post-war. Religion tend to, at least in some groups, tend to fall after horrific events like that, where you're like, well, like you look at the lost generation, for instance, after World War I, what's the point? Some people, of course, find much more solace in religion after an event like that, but a lot of times it kind of shakes the foundations. And so Jane doesn't have a priest she can go to say, hey, can you like exorcise my house? That's not available. The only thing she has available is the legal system, which when what you're experiencing may or may not be real, you don't necessarily want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So that's another element. And then just the Order of the Golden Dawn is this really weird Orientalist hodgepodge nightmare that I did not have the research or the equipment to really explore with as much attention to detail as probably would be necessary. And so I did the easier thing, which was going, well, I'm going to take something that looks like it and we're going to focus on a different aspect of it. And yeah, maybe it'll work.
Awesome. It's so cool to like hear more about the way that you created your world and very carefully tuned all the pieces and you know, built it together.
And I also built some things in that if I ever get to write a sequel, I wanted to lay the groundwork for.
Yeah.
Smart. Which I don't want to go into too much detail about because, you know, the sequel is not on any calendars. I have the plan for it and that's about it. But it has to do with some of the cosmology stuff that Jane learns that may or may not be related to why magic works the way it does.
Just torment me. Just torment me. Sounds like wow, it's already like 5:43. I'm gonna get some of these questions out on the table. Yes, so like everybody wants to know, do you have a background in math? What did you study in school, Caitlin?
I was raised by mathematicians, mathematicians and engineers. I was the book that formed the basis of the math that's in Jane is a book called Zero, The Biography of a Dangerous Idea by Charles Safe. It was given to me by my grandfather when I was about 14 years old. I devoured it. I loved it. There is an appendix in the back that proves mathematically that Winston Churchill was in fact a carrot.
Wow.
That's the kind of thing that stays with you and makes you like math. And I went up through intro level calculus during high school, and then I did statistics in college, but my actual degree is in anthropology with a semi-official minor in psychology. And I enjoyed math, but I hit a point where I no longer understood what I was doing. And that's the point at which I went, I have other interests that I would like to focus on more.
Yeah.
So I am math adjacent. And I did consult with my great aunt, Lynn to make sure that I didn't get anything heinously wrong in this.
Awesome.
So hopefully, fingers crossed. I do have a dream of sending a copy of this to Mr. Safe and being like, I did a weird thing with the book that you wrote. Do you want to see the weird thing? I did a weird thing with Zeno's paradox. Sorry.
I love that.
Once I get up the courage, I'll send him a copy.
So great. Oh, by the way, I really love the psychologist character in this book. Like, she is so cool. Yeah.
Yes.
I want her to have
She's
her
one of
own
my
book.
favorite characters.
Oh,
She's
good.
one of my absolute favorite characters. This is, I'm going to say right up front, this is an encouragement to buy 2 copies of the book. The Barnes & Noble edition has her notes, that character's notes in the back of it, but you should still get your copy from Powell's.
That's right.
So, you know, it's pretty. You can have 2 copies. It's okay.
I love that.
But yeah, the character is Dr. Avdotya Semyonovna Nizamiev, and she runs the asylum, and she has a secondary personal research interest that brings her into contact with Jane and Augustine. She's the page number dedicated to her maybe small, but she is a mighty presence. Possibly more so on a reread.
Oh yeah, I can't wait. So kind of related to our conversation about like the world building and stuff, someone wants to know, did you always envision Jane to be in this kind of a time period?
Yes, she was developed at the exact same time as the time period was. So setting and character went together. Same with Augustine. Dr. Nizamiev is the only character that doesn't apply to. She has been bopping around in my head since I was probably 15 years old. So she's 15 years old now, 15, 16 years old. So she has gone through many iterations, but it was relatively easy to slot her into this time period because a lot of my various disconnected imaginings over the years kind of tend to gravitate back towards a vaguely Victorian setting. I just really like the clothes.
Yeah, right? Who doesn't? What of all of the things that Jane wears, what do you think is your favorite of her outfit?
Okay, the actual answer is spoilery, so I'm not going to say that.
Oh.
I do really like her wedding dress. It's literally a bright blue dress. In my mind, it's like an 1860s-ish boat neck. And it's just like a little bit shiny and just really really bright. There's not a lot of bright colors in this book, but her wedding dress is nice and bright.
Oh, I love that. That's so great. So we've got a couple of folks that want to know, like, how is this book similar and how is it different from your previous works? What was it like transitioning from Luminous Dead to Yellow Jessamine to this one? Like, tell us all about like your experience in writing your work so far, your oeuvre.
So I wrote the Luminous Dead first, and then I wrote the other Jane Lawrence the next year before I had gotten an agent, let alone sold it to a publisher. So they actually came closer together in time. And I wrote Yellow Jessamine after the Luminous Dead had been picked up before it came out. But the main thing that I learned from writing the Luminous Dead was that you can make a character, you can have a character be on their own for a long period of time and have it not be heinously boring if you're clever about it. Because, you know, there's a thing in particular where, at least for me, if you go pages and pages and pages and without any kind of dialogue, it just rhythmically gets you get bogged down. And there are periods in here where Jane is technically alone in the house. But there are still some things that happen to break it up. The other thing is that Luminous Dead had a fairly major revision, right? My publisher was like, well, I really like this book, but what would you feel about, how would you feel about completely changing the second half of the book? And I was like, well, that works. Did it. It really taught me that, like, you can tear a book up and put it back together. And not even because the book is bad and you're trying to make it good. The book can be good and you're trying to make it great. And sometimes that requires ripping it apart at the seams, tossing stuff out, turning stuff 180 degrees, and then plugging it all back in together. And I think if I hadn't had that experience with that big change in the Luminous Dead, the Death of Jane Lawrence went through way more revisions than Luminous Dead ever did. Even though, like, when I first wrote it, it felt like it was close. The changes ended up being so unpredictable from where we started that now in hindsight, they all like, oh, yeah, that was always going to happen to make this book. But I don't think I would have had the confidence needed to stick with it, because I wrote this back in 2016 and it went through 2 or 3 big revisions before we started trying to find a home for it. And then even after that, it still went through, I would say, more refinement at that point. It didn't have any post-acquisition big changes, but there were a couple, like Dark Nights of the Soul, where I was looking at it going, why won't you work? And the answer was always to make it like even weirder than it was before.
Yes, nice. I love it. Here's a great question. Did you do anything special to help you get into a gothic mood while you were writing this book?
When I was first drafting it, I listened on repeat to a particular Spotify playlist that I am currently checking the name of. I'm checking it on my phone though, so I'm not going to be able to drop it in the chat links. I'm sorry. But I think the one that I used for that one was deep dark indie. So just a whole bunch of kind of melancholic dark indie rock songs.
Nice.
And eventually I put together my own playlist, which I posted yesterday on my Twitter account.
Ooh.
And my playlist notably includes 1 or 2 tracks specifically from this show in New York City called Sleep No More, which is a immersive theatrical production of basically Macbeth, where it's all interpretive dance. This sounds weird, stick with me. It is in a 5-story warehouse that you are allowed to explore at will whenever you want to. You wear a mask, you're not allowed to speak. So the entire thing is mostly silent except for music and the sound effects that are created by the actors interacting with their environment. And you can follow characters. You can follow Macbeth through the entire warehouse. And the warehouse is not like a warehouse. It's set up as like the bottom 3 floors are the hotel, the McKittrick Hotel, where everything takes place. The 4th floor is the town of Gallow Greens, which is outside the hotel. And then the 5th floor is a combination. One side of the 5th floor is a graveyard, and the other side is a mental asylum, or maybe just a hospital. It's unclear. And so you can follow characters, you can stay put and wait for characters to come to you, or you can just go explore. I tend to do the latter. And I have been, I'd have enough friends who are fans of this show that they were able to direct me before it was easy to find to the soundtrack that they use, which is a mashup of songs from like the 20s and 30s, and then some Hitchcock movie soundtrack elements and some rave music. And it's this really great, very evocative soundtrack that I borrowed a little bit of for Jane.
I love it. I think we might have time for about one more question. So what can you tell us about what's next for you creatively?
Not very much. not so much that there's not very much ahead of me, but that I can't talk about it. I will say that there is a new book in progress. I can't tell you what the current, like, where it's going to be or anything like that. That all will be revealed in the coming months. But it is a completely new subgenre. It's going to be contemporary-ish next, but we're still going to be in that lovely claustrophobic, isolated space. And like I said, I dream of doing a sequel one day, but that is not currently scheduled. And I also, if you follow me on social media, you may have seen me talking about something I call Fucky Bee's book. That also is still a thing, but it also does not quite have a home yet. So yeah, I'm in one of those periods that happens when you're a writer where stuff is happening, but none of it is solid or publicly facing yet.
Yeah. Hey,
but there will
speaking
be
of social media, did you say something on Twitter the other day about Hannibal fanfic?
Yes.
Like hundreds of thousands of words of Hannibal fanfic?
Yes.
That is amazing.
Yeah, so that's how I've been getting through the pandemic, is I've been writing Hannibal fan fiction, but I am very sneaky about it. So I am sneaky in the sense that I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not going to give my AO3 handle. But if you go on AO3, you can probably find me.
So this has been a lot of quality stuff, folks. So
very creepy and very. So I would argue that Hannibal, the TV show, is, at least the first season, is also gothic horror. Ooh. So if for some reason you haven't seen it and you're like, I want more gothic horror in my life, and I want it to be pretending I want it to see something that's pretending to be a police procedural, but it's actually gothic horror. Ooh. That is the thing to watch.
You've enticed me. I guess I got to start watching Hannibal now. I feel like Nick's going to come on to do our outro in just a second.
There he is.
Yeah, no rush, but yeah, I'm ready. So yeah, it was great conversation, and thank you so much. And I'm definitely gonna be searching for your Hannibal fan fiction, because I'm kind of curious too. So
okay. The hint is that God, what's a good MK Ultra is your hint.
Okay.
And also your indication that my brain I have issues.
But we love those issues.
That's a good hint. That'll be super helpful. So, well, anyway,
not very common.
Yes. So, well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening, for all the great talk and all the fun stuff there. So, I want to remind everyone, here's the book. So please go get a copy through pals.com would be excellent. And while you're there, please check out our other events, our upcoming events that will be up there soon. And we look forward to seeing you at another one very soon. And so thank you both so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks for having us. It was so fun.
Cool. Thank you.